One of the very first gifts we ever gave our kids was this, a money manager bank. What we were trying to teach our kids is that every time they get some money, they get to drop a little bit of money in their spending tube, a little bit of money in their savings tube, and a little bit of money in their giving to God tube. Now the kids thought that was a lot of fun. It was a great game at first. But after a while, it started wearing off. And they started asking serious questions that I think many of us ask. If this is seriously our money, why do we have to put money in the giving tube? Well, what we wanted to teach our kids was that there is a fundamental relationship between our spiritual life and our attitudes and actions concerning money. Now, the concept of the tithe has helped faithful Christians and faithful followers of God for centuries find balance between their spiritual life and their possessions. But being reminded of the tithe makes many of us uncomfortable, even downright angry when we're reminded that we are to give a tithe. There's something at fundamental odds deep down inside of us, and we often justify that by saying that the church should be more about spiritual matters than about money matters. And that's where we've missed the point. The tithe is absolutely about spiritual matters. In fact, the tithe really has very little to do, if anything, to do with money itself. It has everything to do, though, with our discipleship. The tithe has everything to do with our relationship with Jesus Christ. First, let's consider the definition of a tithe. The Old Testament has many examples of God's people observing the practice of giving some portion of the best of what they had to God. This gift was called the first fruits, or the tithe, and it equaled 1/10 of the best of one's flocks or crops or any kind of income that they had to support the priestly ministry. Now, as Christians, we may object to this standard because we understand ourselves under a new covenant and not bound to the law of Moses. But we must remember that the purpose of the law was to give people practical ways of helping them stay in a right relationship with God. Following the law helped a person keep God first, maintain balance with God's people, and provide for a fruitful life. In short, if you wanted to demonstrate your faith in God, you followed the law. But one thing is absolutely clear. The law recognized that there is a fundamental connection between a person's spiritual life and his attitudes and actions concerning money and possessions. But with the coming of Jesus as the fulfillment of the law, how did these expectations change? One thing is absolutely clear. Jesus also recognized a fundamental connection between a person's spiritual life and their attitudes and actions concerning money. But he explained it a bit differently. Consider this. Did Jesus usually lower or raise the standard of obedience for his followers? In Matthew 5, he says, "You have heard it said to the people long ago, 'Do not murder.' But I tell you that anyone who is angry with his brother will be subject to judgment. You have heard it said, 'Do not commit adultery.' But I tell you that anyone who looks at a woman lustfully has already committed adultery in his heart." You see, we must remember that 15% of everything Jesus said is related to money and possessions. He spoke about money and possessions more than he spoke about prayer or even faith. He spoke about money and possessions more than heaven and hell combined. Why? Because Jesus made it clear that there is a connection between a person's spiritual life and their attitudes and actions concerning money. Now, we often divorce the two but Christ sees them as related to each other. Let's consider two stories. First, in Mark 12, Jesus is watching the crowd put money into the temple treasury when someone catches his eye. It was not the rich people putting large sums of money in, but the poor widow who put in all she had, really the equivalent of about a single penny. Jesus points her out to his disciples as an example. What caught Jesus' attention was not that she gave all that she had, but that she demonstrated her total devotion to God and her total trust in God. Now let's look at Luke 12. After hearing the complaint of a man whose brother would not divide the family inheritance, Jesus tells a parable of a rich man who saved up everything for a nice, long, easy retirement. Sounds like the American dream, doesn't it? He worked hard for it, but he spent it all on himself. And Jesus calls him a fool. Tonight, your life is required of you, he says, asking for an accounting of his life before God. And the greatest indictment against the man, the proof of his spiritual condition, was that he was rich toward himself, but not rich toward God. You see, for Jesus, the connection between faith and our possessions rests solely in trust. Trust is the essence of discipleship and a relationship with Jesus Christ. For Jesus, it is this simple. What you do with your money shows where and who you place your trust. Do you place your trust in God or in yourself? You see, the tithe gives us a tool, a benchmark, a measurement to put our trust in the right place. Are you more like the story of the widow's mite? Or are you more like the rich fool? Or are you somewhere in between? We may say we trust God, we may give some time to God, but the rubber meets the road when we are asked to demonstrate that trust by putting that which is most precious to us on the altar. The tithe reveals to us exactly where our priorities are, ourselves or God. And the tithe helps us find balance again. The tithe reminds us and challenges us and guides us to put God first. You see, the tithe really has nothing to do with money at all. It's simply about your relationship with God. After all, God doesn't need your money for himself, for any church budget, or for anything else. God simply wants you, all of you, your devotion, your obedience, your love, your trust. God wants to be at the center of your life. And by giving the first of your finances, the first of your time, the first of your affections, you are showing God that God is first in your life. What is your tithe saying about your relationship with God? Now, this wrestling match of trust between God and ourselves is best revealed sometimes in some of the most commonly asked questions. Is the tithe before or after taxes? Can we include our other charitable giving? Or how about the time we spend volunteering? Honestly, those are the questions that reveal that we are still missing the point. The tithe is not a box to be checked off in our faith. No, the tithe gives us a glimpse into our relationship with God. The tithe is about our trust. Research has shown that the average giving of church members is less than 2.5% of one's annual income. Could it be that this statistic says something about the spiritual state of our people. Clearly, as we are developing living proof disciples here at Christ Church, there is much work that can be done here. But if you are serious about wanting to transform your life by trusting in God with all your heart and all your soul and all your mind and all your strength, then simply start today. Though tithing can be a struggle, it is possible at every income level. But if you cannot give a tithe right away, maybe start by giving regularly just a few dollars every week, even on those days that you're not in church. Or start at 2% or 5% or 7%. Or increase your giving by 10% every year while re-examining your spending habits. Or how about making a Comfort Edge tithe? In a Comfort Edge tithe, determine the amount you give each week that puts you on the edge of your comfort zone, that forces you to trust in God. This is especially good for those who can easily give 10% and still not yet fully demonstrate their trust in God. Whatever you decide, remember that God understands exactly where you are and will help you make any necessary adjustments if you are willing to put God first in your life. Remember, the tithe has really nothing to do with money, but everything to do with your relationship with God. The tithe is not something to check off our spiritual list. It is simply a demonstration of our trust in our living God.